Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bill Baker. I'm delighted to welcome you here on behalf of the University of Lethbridge. The university is honored to be the host of the Alec Johnson lecture series. This is the inaugural lecture, and we hope it goes on for many, many years. These lecture series are important in a variety of ways. I remember my introduction to university, actually, I grew up in Toronto. And I remember my first introduction to the University of Toronto was when my father took me to such a lecture series. I don't remember how old I was, but I think I was 10 or 11. And I remember that occasion, not for the content, but I do remember that it was an occasion. We put on our Sunday best, and we went. It was the Gray Memorial Lecture Series, and one of the first speaker for that series had been Louis Saint Laurent. This was something that annually has gone on at the University of Toronto, and I remember being very impressed. Of course, dressing up in Toronto was not all that unique. I mean, in those days, even if you were going to Maple Leaf Gardens to watch the Leafs play, you dressed up in your Sunday best. But these are important occasions for a university, and as a university grows and matures, it develops some of these lecture series. We have this one. We've had for a number of years the Lethbridge Herald lectures. We have the Owen Holmes lecture series. We have the Priestley lectures. And there are other ongoing lecture series. For example, the Department of Psychology, the faculty members in that department have put together a fund where they bring in speakers on a regular basis. This particular lecture series is in honor of the memory of Alec Johnson. And some of the other speakers will talk more about that, but just as a matter of interest, you might want to know that the Lethbridge Historical Society has provided a very substantial amount of money for this series. But the other sponsors include organizations such as the Alberta Historical Society, and the Vice President of the Historical Society of Alberta is with us today in the person of Terry Chapman. And, but then there are many, many individuals that have contributed to this, and I think it demonstrates the impact that Alec Johnson had on our lives in a variety of contexts. I should finally say that I'm honored to welcome you to the university on this occasion, and to indicate that the Chancellor of the university had intended to be here but was unfortunately not able to attend. And so, without further ado, let me turn it over to Carlton Stewart, who will speak on behalf of the Lethbridge Historical Society about Dr. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Guest Speaker, friends of Alec Johnson, and guests, it is my honor and pleasure to have been asked to present this portion of our program this evening. I first met Alec Johnson in 1966 when I was working for the printing department of the Lethbridge Herald. We were printing a book entitled Boats and Barges on the Belly, written by Alec for the Historical Society. Alec was at the time approximately 46 years old. He was the first civil servant with which I had any dealings, close dealings. By all standards that I had falsely compiled, a civil servant was not one that was readily known as energetic, active, or caring. I thought to myself, hold on here, something's wrong. Alec did not fit this image that I had conjured up in the least. In fact, he was as far from meeting that criteria as one could possibly get. As a result, I quickly changed my image of civil servants. I've met some others since then who are just as likable as Alec was. Alec Johnson was born on January 26, 1920, in Webb, Saskatchewan, where he received his schooling and where he grew up on the farm during the early 30s. After graduation from high school, Alec obtained a degree of BSA at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon in 1941. He later attended the University of Montana at Bozeman, culminating in a Master of Science degree in 1954. Alec was employed at Agricultural Canada for his entire working life, except for 3 years overseas in the Canadian Army during the Second World War and a posting with the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization in West Pakistan during the early 60s. Alec was active in many organizations that his profession involved him with. In the Society of Range Management, which was Alec's specialty, he achieved its highest level of professional achievement. He was recognized as being a charter and a life member. Alec was a prolific writer with over 65 papers and over 140 miscellaneous articles, books, booklets to his credit. His lifetime awards number some 20, coming from his profession, his interest in history, and from other fields. He was especially proud of his Alberta Order of Excellence achievement. Alec's interest in history was his second love. Maybe it was his first. He was president of the Lethbridge Historical Society for approximately 20 years. Upon his retirement from that position, a special position on the executive was created just for him, that being executive director. Under Alec's presidency, the Society founded the Sir Alexander Galt Museum. This project quickly grew too large for the Society to manage and was turned over to the City of Lethbridge. Our major projects thereafter turned to publishing of books, and Alec was our mainstay. He served many years on the Historical Society of Alberta executive, including president. He was on the board of the Glenbow Alberta Institute, the Alberta Historical Resources Foundation, the Government House Foundation in Edmonton, the Fort Rupup Interpretive Society. He was one of 6 persons who was the founding members of the Alberta Museums Association. He was on the board of governors of this university and was granted an honorary doctorate by this same university. In 1973, Alec was initiated into the Kainai chieftainship, a position he held very highly, and served them as vice president and president during his 10 years there. One might ask, what kind of a person was Alec Johnson? Well, I feel I knew Alec about as well as anyone over the last 24 years. Outwardly, Alec was very friendly, yet I found him to really be a loner. He didn't relish the thought of social functions or dropping in for a friendly visit, unless, of course, it was business or of the Historical Society, the museum, or a project you jointly had underway, or if you had a question that he might answer for you. Whenever you dropped in to see him or phoned him for some information and he didn't have it readily right there, shortly after you had left or hung up the phone would be ringing again. He would have found your answer to your question. He always turned down invitations to drop over for a meal, even during festive times. Life was too short for him for idle chit-chat or what he would call frivolous activity. I don't suppose he ever turned down a request to prepare or deliver a talk on history. Sometimes he would tell me that he had as many as 3 different functions to be at in one day. His joy was history and telling about it to anyone who would listen. Shortly before his death, the Society was in the midst of arranging Financing for Lethbridge, its coal industry, Alec's last book. The time-consuming process of getting approval from the Society to publish it was a source of great frustration for him. In fact, before approval was attained, the manuscript was already in the hands of the printer and well underway. He was prepared to finance the project on his own so it would be out of the way so he could carry on with the next one. About a month before his passing, he confided in me, explaining this urgency. Evidently, he had made a study of his ancestry. It indicated that many of them had become invalided about the age of 71, and he was sure that he was going to be afflicted with this same thing. The news of his death on April the 12th, 1989 was a shock to all of us. What a loss. What were we going to do? The whole society revolved around Alec and his work. He was the Lethbridge Historical Society. When the initial shock was over, our society looked for a way and a project to recognize Alec and his work and what he meant to us. We wanted a lasting one that would be that his wide spectrum of friends and associates could contribute to as well. One that Alec himself would have encouraged for our community had he lived. A lecture series that would bring prominent and popular historians to give public lectures now and forever seemed to be the answer. One that we think that Alec would have been pleased with. Once again, it's my pleasure to have had this privilege and the opportunity to bring this segment of the program to our gathering this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Raymond Hugh A from the Department of History. On behalf of the Selection Committee for the Alec Johnson Lectures, it gives me great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. The Selection Committee is comprised of members of the Departments of History and Geography, as well as 2 members from the Historical Society, or the Lethbridge Historical Society. The Selection Committee feels that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to find a more appropriate speaker for this inaugural lecture. To begin with, our selection, Dr. Hugh Dempsey, is very knowledgeable about the history of Alberta in general and southern Alberta in particular. In addition, Hugh Dempsey and Alec Johnson were close friends and associates, and Hugh has researched and written about many of the themes that interested Alex. Hugh Dempsey is currently Associate Director of the Glenbow Museum in Calgary. Prior to that, he was a reporter for the Edmonton Bulletin and served 4 years doing publicity work for the Alberta government and being responsible for the government's Historic Sites program. In 1956, he joined the newly created Glenbow Foundation in Calgary and was its archivist until 1967. He then served in various administrative roles within Glenbow, including his current appointment of Associate Director in 1986. He is the author of several books, including The Gentle Persuader, a biography of Senator James Gladstone, his father-in-law. 3 other books, Crowfoot, Chief of the Blackfoot, Red Crow, Warrior Chief, and Charcoal's World, deal with the Blackfoot Indians. He also wrote History in Their Blood, an examination of the Indian paintings of the Russian émigré painter Nicolas de Grandmaison. In addition to the 9 books he has authored, Hugh has edited another 14 and written 17 monographs and 190 articles and technical papers. In addition to these administrative and creative activities, Hugh is also the editor of the quarterly publication Alberta History. He has been awarded the Order of Canada. He has been awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Calgary and an honorary chieftainship from the Blood tribe. He is married to Pauline Gladstone, a member of the Blood tribe, and they have 5 children. Their eldest son, James, is an instructor in Native history at the Federated Indian College in Saskatoon. And so, without further comments, I'll ask Dr. Dempsey to give the inaugural lecture. Dr. Dempsey has informed me that he will entertain questions after his talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray, for those kind words. I agree with the comments of Carly that Alec Johnson was a wonderful contribution to the preservation of the history of Lethbridge and district. He was, in many ways, Mr. Lethbridge. And I feel both flattered and I appreciate being invited to address the first in this series of Alec Johnson Memorial Lectures. I selected as a topic something that Alex and I had touched on at various times during our many discussions and our common interests, and that is something that related to the period of the whiskey trade when Fort Hoopup was the main structure that existed in this region. I recall Alex's work in trying to determine just what the flag looked like that flew over Fort McLeod, Fort Hoopup. It's what it looked like so that he could have a copy made, and this became a symbol that has become very common in the Lethbridge area. The period of the whiskey trade ranged from 1869 to 1874. And there have been many books and articles written about this particular time period. It had its beginning at the time that Rupert's Land, or what is now Western Canada, was transferred from the authority of Great Britain to that of the newly formed Dominion of Canada. But Canada had no legal means to supervise this land that it had acquired. A number of enterprising merchants, starting with John J. Healy and Alfred B. Hamilton, who were having problems with American law and order in their efforts to become rich in trading with the Indians, saw this land across the 49th parallel as an ideal place where they could trade without concern of the law. There they could trade whiskey, repeating rifles, other objects that would reap great profits. So in 1869, they were the first to cross the line, established Fort Hamilton that became Fort Hoopup, made $50,000 the first year, and from then on, a lot of people were trying to get in on the act. Traders coming up, establishing forts at Fort Kip and Slide Out and Standoff and other places throughout southern Alberta where there was no law except that of the gun. Now, opinions by later historians about that period vary greatly depending on who you're listening to. John Peter Turner, for example, the historian for the Northwest Mounted Police, or for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, comments in his book, talking about Fort Hoopup. From this perverted hangout sprang the traffic with which the Montana freebooters, in their greed for buffalo robes, debauched the wild hunters of the Canadian West. On the other hand, Paul Sharp, an American historian, writes, by frontier standards, most of them, that's the men, the whiskey traders, most of them were decent men, abiding by the strict customs of their social group and living by the code of the community. Well, however you look at it, good men or bad men, and I have a feeling they were a mixture of both, what they were doing was disastrous for the the Indians of this region. But what about these traders themselves? They were all types, from all walks of life. They ranged from people like Joe Spearson, who on the streets of Fort Benton heard an Indian bragging about his war exploits in which he had killed a white man. And Joe Spearson promptly shot and killed the Indian and threw his body into the Missouri River. The fact that Joe Spearson himself was killed a few years later perhaps gave a few some satisfaction. Ranged there from him to people like Charles Conrad, who became one of the first millionaires in the state of Montana. Or to workers like a man who was known only by the name of Yeast Powder Bill, or on more formal occasions he was known as Self-Rising William. Ranging from him to people like William Gladstone, who was an ex-Hudson's Bay boat builder who constructed the large Fort Hoop-Up that replaced the first one after it was destroyed by fire. But all of these men had one thing in common. They were all young. Most of them were single, and they were alone. It was quite natural that they would look for companionship, for female companionship. And the only type of companionship available was from the native women of this region, the Blackfoot, the Blood, and the Piegan tribes. And this, of course, then is where they turned. Actually, this reminds me of a story when you talk about Indian-white relations in this way, about a man who went on an Indian reserve, and after being there for a little while, he called this one Indian over and he said, "I've noticed something a little strange. Maybe you can explain it to me. I see there's quite a few Indians here with the name of Cardinal and Deschamps." He said, "Now I assume that somewhere in the background they had French-Canadian ancestry. And I see others with the name of McNabb and McDonald, and I assume that there's a Scottish background." He said, "But I don't see anybody here that has an Irish name." And so the old Indian just shook his head and he said, "Well, you know, those women, they had to draw the line somewhere." Well, tonight I'd like to look at a few of these union of whiskey traders, native women, and their progeny. As I say, there's all types of men. There were killers, there were businessmen, there were illiterates, there were wife beaters, and there were good family men. Just as the wives, the native women themselves were varied, from homebodies to those who were very strong-willed and independent, to those whose morals might be questioned, intelligent women, all kinds. In short, they were a cross-section of society at that time. On that matter of relationships, I'd like to read a partial comment that was published in the Fort Benton Record in 1880. And if any of you are sensitive about the use of the word squaw, all I can say is it does appear in literature at that time. So these are somebody else's words, not mine. Published February 18th, 1880 by somebody who signed himself simply as S.M. "My lawful partner is a squaw. She is not a high-toned lady, as some persons may suppose, on account of her direct descendant from the Bloods. When I first met her, she was picking huckleberries amidst the tangled briars in the forest in the vicinity of Chief Mountain. To my unsophisticated eyes, she seemed a beauty, and, as the father of her family offered to transfer her to me for a broken-down pony, I considered it a cheap way to make an end to my lonely existence. I felt proud of my new possession and would gaze for hours upon her unwashed countenance with the deepest admiration. In those days, I thought she someday might turn into a Pocahontas, and I regretted only that I could not reveal all my intentions in regard to her future welfare in any language that she could understand. I indulged the hope of being enabled to take her to the States someday and fix her up in silk and satin. She has stuck to me faithfully for these several years, and her devotion has been rewarded by a lawful marriage, which I found necessary to ensure our future happiness. My woman will never turn out to be a princess, and although I have partially succeeded in domesticating her, all efforts at culinary education have proven a failure. She uses an astonishing amount of calico to keep herself dressed up. However, I have become so used to her ways that I don't mind her shortcomings much anymore. White strangers hardly ever visit us, and we never invite any of them to our fireside. I have been what I am through choice, and social status does not bother me. My 2 boys left me about 6 months ago to join a war party of Indians on a horse raiding expedition against the Sioux. I have not heard from them since, but I suppose they're all right. Now there you get the kind of attitude and feeling of someone who was part of that whiskey trading era and how he perceived his mate at that time. And the wives could be and were quite supportive of their husbands. They often, at the time of marriage, they would live in the whiskey forts at the trading post, or sometimes in a teepee nearby, depending on the war conditions, and would provide food and sustenance and care for the family. L.B. Kelly describes one situation that was perhaps not uncommon. He says, early in the spring of 1871, Fred Knaus came into the Hudson's Bay Territory to establish a trading post. The party consisted of 3 other white men and an Indian squaw. They built a strong fort of logs on the Elbow River, 3 or 4 miles up from the Bow. During a 3-day attack by Bloods under White Eagle, the squaw did splendid service in keeping the rifles loaded. Now this was a Blood woman and was quite prepared to back her husband against her own people. And they give you some idea of the appearance of some of these brides of the whiskey traders. Another traveler in 1873 made this comment. He was at a whiskey fort at the time. I took particular notice of a young squaw. She had a dress made of a very light-colored and well-turned buckskin. It was made to conform to the shape of the body. It was trimmed with the usual buckskin fringe, but also had a double row of elk's teeth in a semicircle beneath the neck, and quite a number on the sleeves. Taken all in all, it was quite a spectacular-looking dress. I think what he's trying to say politely, it was quite a spectacular-looking girl. Now, among the whiskey traders, there were various social strata. And those at the top of the strata, that is the owners, the people who put money into the trade, who built the forts themselves. They often married for business reasons as well as love. If a trader was going into an area, it would not be uncommon for him to determine what chief held domination over that area, and then attempt to marry the daughter or close relative of the leading chief, to cement relations, friendly relations between the two, both for safety and for the purpose of ensuring a good trade. For example, Charles Conrad, who eventually became the owner of I.G. Baker, one of the 2 main suppliers to the whiskey trade, and also the owner of a number of whiskey forts, wed a Blood woman by the name of Cayuse, who was the daughter of a chief. Unfortunately, we don't have the name. Alfred B. Hamilton, who is one of the co-owners of Fort Hoopup, married a woman by the name of Double Gun Woman, who was the daughter of Piegan Chief Ironbreast. D.W. Davis, the Canadian manager of I.G. Baker, married Revenge Walker, a sister of Blood Chief Red Crow. And Charlie Thomas, a co-owner of Fort Kip, wed Mary, the daughter of Piegan Chief Full Eagle. So you can see that these were political marriages as well as means of overcoming the loneliness of the frontier. At the other end of the spectrum, there were workmen who married simply for love or sex, or whichever you want to say. Examples, Ben DeRoche who was an interpreter at Fort Hoopup, married Margaret, the daughter of Going to the Sun, who was a Piegan Indian. Dave Akers, who was a clerk at the fort, married a woman by the name of Underbeaver, also a blood. George Houck, teamster, married a mixed blood girl by the name of Monique, who was a daughter of Augustus Armel and a Piegan woman. Now those three examples I give you are all ones that appeared to have married for love, because they all stayed with their wives and their families until their dying day. But it wasn't so with all the traders. Some saw the women as temporary bed partners. One good example is Fred Knaus, who in the 5 or 6 years he was in the whiskey trade bragged that he had had at least 50 Indian wives. Others had some concern, even though they didn't want to have a permanent relationship, they had some concern about their wives, so that when they decided to leave the country, they would place their wife with another trader. And so you find certain women who list 2 or 3 whiskey traders as having been their husbands at different times, because the man, the first one leaving, was concerned about the welfare of his wife and just did not want to abandon her. And there were some men that once they left the whiskey trade, took their children with them, probably over the protests of the wife. But again, I would think a 6-gun would have more strength than tears. But it's the children I'd like to talk about tonight. And as far as I could see, that in later years, after the whiskey trading period, there were 3 main options open to these children. They could become integrated into the white society. This did happen. I'll give you a couple of examples of this later on. Not the most frequent occurrence, however. Or they could become part of a half-breed community. And this in southern Alberta was quite rare, because what you have is one generation, one brief period of time when this intermarriage was taking place, practically none before it, very little afterwards. Unlike the situation among the Indians involved with the Hudson's Bay Company, the Cree and the Ojibwa, where intermarriage took place over a great many generations, and gradually a separate society, identifiable Métis or half-breed society, evolved. This didn't happen in southern Alberta. And so most of those people who were of mixed blood ancestry, if you want to use the word half-breed, would not congregate to, say, the half-breeds farther north. Because more important than being a mixed blood was the fact that the person in the south was a Blackfoot and the person in the north was a Cree. And if they're going to see the Cree, they're probably going to go there to kill him, not to join his society. The enemy, the animosity between Cree and Blackfoot was far greater than any unity of background. Yet there were a few of these people around, and in 1906, the Indian agent on the Blood Reserve was asked his opinion about these people of mixed ancestry and the marriages that had taken place between the whiskey traders and the native women. And he stated, and I quote, "These mixed marriages are a thing of the past in this district. The only matter we have to deal with in connection with this subject in the future are the grown-up and nearly grown-up progeny of the numerous unions of this class. Most of these children have become incorporated into the Indian tribes of their mothers, but there are some drifting about the country, pariah-like, acknowledged neither by Indians or whites." And that leads us to the third option, or the third category, and that is of those progeny who went with their mothers, became part of the tribe, and went on to become treaty Indians. And that was the most frequent occurrence as far as the mixed blood children of the whiskey trade are concerned. So much so that there is a legacy evident today within some of the Indian reserves, Blood Reserve, Piegans, Blackfeet Reservation in the United States, where family names still survive, like Kip, Abbott, Coble, Healy, Gladstone, Wren, Mills. All of these were the names of original whiskey traders, and these names have survived to this day. Other names at one time common on reserves have disappeared. Probably too many girls in the family. Names like Akers, Hamilton, La Chapelle, and so on. So these Indians that went back to or these mixed bloods that went back to the reserve were the most successful, had the most happy lives, although difficult, and often became leaders in their own reserves. The main area where they encountered resentment was in the United States on the Blackfeet Reservation, because in the United States, the legal status of Indian is based upon blood quantum. That is, what percentage of Indian blood do you have? And this gave rise to the terms full blood and mixed blood. And that in itself is a divisive designation that would cause people to separate, saying, I'm a full blood and look at all those bloody mixed bloods, or vice versa. And so there was antagonism for a much longer period between those descendants of the whiskey trade and the members, the full-blood members of the Native community. Other successes besides those who went back to the reserve occurred where the family stayed together, where the husband stayed with the wife, stayed in the country, and after the land became settled, after the settlers arrived, they usually took a homestead or went into business somewhere close to their wife's reserve, or in the United States, right on the reservation itself. Let me give you a couple of examples in this area where this did occur. George Houck is probably a good one to start with. It'd be even better if I can find my notes. George Houck was born in Pennsylvania and arrived in Montana in 1866, where he was a carpenter and teamster. He became the sheriff of Choteau County and then went into the whiskey trade as a teamster, mostly between Fort Benton and Fort Hoopup. In 1875, he married Monique Armel, the daughter of an old fur trader from the American Fur Company days and a Piegan woman. They had a son by the name of Presley, and no, he didn't have a middle name of Elvis. Houck settled in Lethbridge in 1885 and opened a wholesale liquor store and became one of Lethbridge's most prominent old-timers, particularly in his participation in the exhibitions and in the parades where he would lead the Indian contingent. In Alec Johnson's History of Lethbridge, there's an excellent picture of George Houck and his native wife. His son Presley worked with him, and as far as I could determine, was a positive influence on the community. Presley married a girl who was also a daughter of the whiskey trade. She was the daughter of Saul Abbott, who had been one of the builders of Slideout. And she had a sister by the name of Nellie, again a product of the whiskey trade, who was rather interesting. She married a white man and moved to North Dakota, where the two of them opened a restaurant near a military base. However, they split up. He returned to eastern United States. But she came back to her own part of the country, and she opened her own restaurant in Cutbank. And then when the railway went through between Lethbridge and Great Falls, she opened a restaurant in Coots. Then in 1906, she moved to Lethbridge, where she opened her own restaurant and operated it for a short time until she decided to go to Shelby, where she built a hotel and restaurant and was running it successfully, the last information I had. So there are some people who, with stability within the family, were able to do quite well. Another example is Dave Akers, and he's another famous Lethbridgeite. He was born in Missouri and was a woodcutter on the Missouri River. After prospecting for gold, he came to Hoopup to work for John Healy. And after the police arrived, he bought out Fort Hoopup, and it became his home. For many years afterwards, he used to grow vegetables and sell them in town. He gained his ultimate notoriety in 1894 when he got into a dispute with another old-timer, Tom Purcell, and was shot to death. He left a Blood Indian widow and 2 children, Lizzie and Minnie Akers. Their mother then married an Indian by the name of the Neck and returned to her reserve. I want to talk about Minnie for a minute. Minnie was one of the children. She went to the mission school on the Blood Reserve, and after graduation she came into Lethbridge, where she opened a dress shop in the late teens and operated into the early 20s. Then, with the price of grain going high, and looking at the reserve and all the undeveloped land, she went back to the reserve and demanded a piece of land that she could farm herself. At that time, there was not a woman on the Blood Reserve who was a sole farmer. But she insisted that she got her land and she ran her farm. Sometime later, she married her next-door neighbor, Cecil Tallow, and between them, they became one of the wealthier families on the Blood Reserve. In 1939, Esther Goldfrank, an anthropologist, met Minnie and described her as follows. At 45, she is beautiful, soft-voiced, and charming. She wears good clothes, her children are handsome and well-dressed, and her house is well-appointed. So there again is an example of someone who, with the unity of family, was able to make that successful transition. Now, there are a few instances where traders left the area and took their children with them. I mentioned this earlier. I'll give you a couple of examples. Alfred B. Hamilton, the co-owner of Fort Hoopa, when he split with his wife, Double Gun Woman, she went back to her people with one of her children. But Hamilton took the daughter, Grace, and raised her in Montana. And then when he followed the gold rush into Alaska, he took Grace with him. And in the north, she married M.F. Brown, and they later settled in Seattle. And to my knowledge, she never had anything to do with the Pagans, never returned to her people again. Charlie Thomas, the owner, one of the 2 owners of Fort Kipp, split with his wife, sent her back to the reservation, and kept the 3 children. There was some problem there that I'm not fully aware of, because he wasn't able to look after the 3 children. He was just able to take the oldest one, Ida, and he kept her with him and raised her in Helena, Montana. The next oldest, Hattie, he placed with the Lippincott family in Great Falls, and when they later moved to Spokane, she went with them and she died there. Charles Jr. was raised by the Embleton family in Fort Benton and was educated in Fort Benton. It's interesting that later, however, both the oldest and the youngest, Ida and Charles, went back to the reservation, claimed land that was due to them, and by 1899, they were the joint owners of farmland cultivating some 300 acres and had a good herd of cattle. So they had gone away with their father, but ultimately returned to their mother's people. Now, because there were these successes, this isn't to say that life was always simple for these children, because sometimes they were rejected, either by the native people and certainly by the white community. Often they lacked a proper education and experienced a life of poverty. Those with a very fair skin were often tempted and succumbed to the temptation of becoming bootleggers, because they could go into the bars or to go into the liquor vendors to obtain liquor, which they would then in turn sell to the Indians. This very often led to a life of debauchery and crime. And I know of at least one child of that era who died in the penitentiary in Montana. But let me give you 3 case studies of 3 children. These are not necessarily typical, because I guess you can ask, is anybody typical? The first is Charles Edward Conrad Jr. He was known as Edward. He was a son of Charles Edward Conrad that I mentioned earlier, who became the owner of the I.G. Baker Company. He was born in 1876. His mother, named Cayuse, was a blood Indian. And there's some mystery about his early years, because when the Conrad family became successful, this early Indian marriage, I think, was a bit of an embarrassment to Conrad's in the western frontier. The family stated that the mother abandoned the boy, Edward, as a baby, and that the father sent the child as a 2-year-old to be raised and later educated in Montreal. However, the missionary records show that a 6-year-old Edward was still alive and with his mother on the Blood Reserve. And I suspect what has happened and why this fiction has arisen is that in 1879, when the boy was just a little over 2 years old, Charles, the father, married a white woman by the name of Alicia Stanford. And I think it became a convenient fiction to say the Indian mother had died, so now he was free to marry, when in fact it appears that she was back on the reserve with her little boy. In any case, the father did take Edward, probably at about the age of 6 or 7, and sent him to Montreal, where he was educated. There can be no question, certainly no question in my mind, that Charles loved his son. He treated him well. As a matter of fact, an indication of this is that in later years, when he had his own white family, in his will, he provided equal shares to all of his children, including the mixed blood Edward. One of the stipulations, however, throughout the period of the life of both father and son, was that Edward never return from the East, never come back to the white Conrad family. Because over those years, Charles Conrad became one of the wealthiest men in the state of Montana. After Edward completed his education, he got funding from his father and opened a business called the Porter Conrad Importing Company. But it's obvious that he was a poor businessman, and within 2 years he was already $40,000 in debt, which his father bankrolled. In 1902, he wrote to his stepmother saying, "I have been a black sheep, and like a prodigal, return after spending all his wealth." In 1900, Edward married a French-Canadian girl, a big wedding in Montreal, at which his father, his stepmother, and stepsister all attended. And after the ceremony was over, Charles presented his son with a $10,000 house in Montreal. $10,000 house in Montreal must have been a pretty good house. The father died in 1902, leaving an estate of $2.5 million. But there was one stipulation. None of the children were to inherit the money for 11 years. During those 11 years, each of them would get an allowance of $150 a month. Edward wanted to get his hands on the money right now. So he went to lawyers in New York. He tried to have the will broken and was unsuccessful. And so finally, again anxious to get money, he sold his interest in the estate to his half-brother for $88,000. The estate after the 11 years would have been worth approximately $250,000. 2 years later, at the age of 28, Edward died mysteriously and penniless. He had blown his 88 grand and was very, very deeply in debt. So this is one son of a whiskey trader, treated well by his family, by his father, but turned out to be an irresponsible, spoiled young dandy. There's a photograph of him in a book on the history of the Conrad family, where you see someone who I shouldn't say looks like a spoiled brat, but looks like a spoiled brat. Now, there's some similarities between Edward and the next example, and that is Jefferson Davis. That sounds like a good historical name, doesn't it? Jefferson Davis was the eldest son of D.W. Davis and his blood Indian wife, Revenge Walker. Now, after the settlement period, D.W. Davis took his family responsibilities seriously, even though he sent his wife back to the reserve and later married a white woman. He took responsibility for his 3 oldest children by his Indian wife. And one of these, the oldest, Jeff, was sent to school in Port Hope, Ontario, where he was an outstanding student and a great athlete. At the outbreak of the Boer War, he enlisted and rose through the ranks to become a lieutenant, and was highly regarded as a strong leader and very, very popular among his friends. After the Boer War, he returned to this area, took a farm just north of Fort Macleod, but his success was short-lived. In rather purple prose, L.V. Kelly describes what happened. He became a fine young man and a gentleman. He went to his home country after the war, back to the range where the red man wandered, and the teepees of his mother called silently. He went and became just a half-breed, shiftless, immoral, and whiskey-sodden, unquote. Poor Jeff died in a farming accident near Macleod in 1906. Now, in contrast is the youngest of the Indian children. I mentioned that D.W. Davis took responsibility for the 3 eldest, but Charlie was the youngest by this Indian marriage. And I don't know exactly why he was not included in this education, this assistance that D.W. provided to the other 3 children. But I think it's one of 2 reasons. One is a possibility that at the time that D.W. married his white wife in 1887, Charlie was only 10 years old. And it would have been somewhat of an embarrassment to this Eastern-born wife to have this little mixed-blood Indian kid running around the house. But I think a more likely reason was Revenge Walker, D.W.'s wife. She was a very strong-minded woman. And I think when it came to Charlie, she said, enough already. I have lost my 3 oldest. They are gone from me. They are gone from our extended family. You're not taking Charlie. So when she went back to the reserve, she took Charlie with her. She married again, married a man by the name of Pa'an, or falling over a bank. And Pa'an gave this little boy the Indian name of Hollering in the Morning. Charlie never went to school. He lived in the Indian way, was raised in the Indian way. So much so that in 1904, he was arrested for stealing horses and served 2 years in penitentiary by following an age-old practice of the Blood Indians. He was a wild character. In 1913, he got in trouble again for beating up a rancher, but eventually he settled down. He married Rosie, the daughter of a trader named John Smith, and a blood woman by the name of Tepitkini, who incidentally was my wife's grandmother. And between the 2 of them, between Charlie and Rosie, they raised a fine family on the Blood Reserve. When I knew him, Charlie was a rich and successful rancher. He spoke no English, was the owner of the Longtime Medicine Pipe, and a member of the All Braves Dog Society. He was a very positive part of the community, a minor chief of the tribe, and a very influential person. He had found the best world that he could find. So Beverly Stacy, in her very fine article on D.W. Davis that appeared a couple of issues ago in Alberta History, was probably right when she quotes a fur trader who was describing a situation out on the Pacific coast that was similar to Davis's. She says, "At great expense, He gave 2 of his sons regular education in England, but he keeps the 3rd as a common Indian. I dare say the heathen is the happiest of them all. And by the 3 examples I've given you, the first 2 ending in some degree of tragedy, I think you might want to agree. In succeeding generations, many progeny of these whiskey traders have gone on to their own successes. James Gladstone, got to get a plug in here, grandson of William Gladstone, the man who did the carpentry work on Fort Hoopup, became Canada's first Indian senator. Everett Soup, long known as the cartoonist for the Kainai News, and Glenville will be publishing a book of his writings very shortly because he's also an excellent writer, is the great-grandson of Joe Healy. That is the Indian Joe Healy, who was a brother of John J. Healy, the owner of Fort Hoopup. Flora Zaharia, granddaughter of Fred Knaus, recently retired as the head of Indian education for Manitoba. So there are many more examples where these grandchildren, great-grandchildren of these whiskey traders have gone on to become reserve, local, or national leaders. There can be no question, however, that those children of the whiskey trade who were the happiest and most successful were those who stayed with their mother's people, the tribes of the Blackfoot Nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen?
You mean I answered them all?
We can't let him off this easy.
G. Ryder Davis, who was longtime mayor of Fort Macleod, was part of the second family of D.W. Davis. That is, D.W. Davis had these 4 children by his Indian wife, Revenge Walker. And then in 1887, he married a member of the Greer family, a white woman, and then had other children by that family. And G. Ryder Davis was a part of that family. So there was no Indian blood in him at all. And it was very interesting because I knew both Ryder Davis quite well, and I knew Charlie Davis. And for a great many years, Ryder Davis in particular would not acknowledge, as the mayor of Fort Macleod, that the minor chief on the Blood Reserve was actually his half-brother. It was only in later years, when situations changed, that the atmosphere changed, that he was quite prepared then to welcome his brother, had him over to his house, and they became more or less friends with the language and cultural barriers that existed.
I wonder if you could expand on why there was no further intermarriage in some Alberta when there was intermarriage in other areas.
There was some intermarriage after the whiskey trading era, particularly with mounted police. There were a fair number of Indians of this area who either had children by or were legally married to mounted policemen. So that would take one from 1874, which is the end of the whiskey trading era, the beginning of the mounted police era, up through then until the 1880s. And any marriage, Indian white marriages that took place after the settlement period, were by and large, and I'll have to be careful how I say this, were by and large with Indians and undesirable elements of the white society. The men who were the bootleggers, the men who were involved with Indians in a negative way. The main exceptions during that time, and I'm talking about the 1880s, 1890s, along in that period to the turn of the century, the main exceptions, I would say, were those who in some way were attached either to the Indian department or to the churches. And there were some marriages that took place, particularly as a result of attachment to the Indian department. But by numbers, they weren't great. And of course, one of the reasons was that in the whiskey trading era, many of the whiskey traders married Indian women because there were no white women. Now, after the settlement period, there were white women available, so to speak, and therefore, because of the cultural and economic gaps between Indians and whites, the prospect of a person marrying an Indian was not good, and also the social acceptability was very bad, as implied by that part that I read about the man in 1880 describing how people don't come to visit him and he doesn't ask them over because he's married to an Indian.
You mentioned the name Going to the Sun.
Yeah.
And I've always assumed that it was maybe a construction worker named the highway because of its location. Is it possible now it was named for an Indian?
Oh yes, the Going to the Sun Highway in Glacier Park, from my understanding, was named after, not this particular man, was named after an earlier Piegan Indian by the name of Going to the Sun, who was quite a prominent chief back in maybe the second quarter of the 19th century. Now that's what I've been told. I've never done any great research on it, but I have experienced, I've run into the name of Going to the Sun on a number of occasions as being a family name. Try. All right, there's been an argument going on for a great many years as to which is right, Blackfoot or Blackfeet. If one looks at the word itself, Siksika, it doesn't give you any help, because the way the Blackfoot language works is that you create compound words by taking the roots, a compound noun by taking the roots of other nouns, or adjectives or whatever. Now in this case, Siksika is taken from the word Siksi, the first part of it is taken from the word Siksinum, meaning black. The last part of it, Ka, is taken from the middle of either Ohkat or Ohkats. Ohkat meaning foot or Ohkats meaning feet. But the root that you take out of the singular or the plural is exactly the same. So you can't tell by the word Siksika as to whether the word should be Blackfoot or Blackfeet. Now in the mythology or the legend of how the name came, it's talking about a man walking across the prairie to another camp, and they said, "Where are you from?" "I'm from those other Indians." "Well, look at your feet. We're going to call you, your tribe, Siksika." Now I can't imagine that person hopping on one leg all the way across the burned prairie, so it's quite likely he was talking about Blackfeet. So you have that possible explanation. In 1855, when the Indians signed treaty with the Americans, the treaty was with the Blackfoot Indians. An adhesion to that, a second version of that treaty a number of years later was with the Blackfeet Indians. So in the legal documents in the United States, Blackfoot and Blackfeet both were used. In Canada, when the treaty was signed in 1877, it was signed with the Blackfoot Indians. A couple of months later, some Indians who had missed out on this signed an adhesion to that treaty, and that adhesion listed them as the Blackfeet Indians. So you get this interchangeability. What has happened then over a period of time is that in the United States, the Indians on the reservation down there have been legally incorporated as the Blackfeet Indians of Montana, and they refer to themselves as Blackfeet. In Canada, the legal designation of the reserve up near Gleason is the Blackfoot Indian Reserve, and they refer to themselves as Blackfoot, even though they're all the same people. Generally speaking, anthropologists, historians, scholars, and so on, all over the world generally use Blackfoot. People who write for popular histories often use Blackfeet. We've even had some Indians in Montana who use the word Blackfoots, if you like that one. Or you can do what the University of Oklahoma Press has done in their style guide and used Blackfeet as a noun and Blackfoot as an adjective. So you talk about the Blackfeet had so many Blackfoot children. In the end, I believe the best answer or comment on all this was given by John C. Ewers of the Smithsonian Institution, who said, "No one will ever prove one right and the other wrong, so let's argue about something else."
Dr. Dempsey, Jerry Potts, where does he fit into the whiskey trade intermarriage?
Yes. Now, what I deliberately didn't do was included a number of people who were part of the whiskey trade, but they themselves were not white, because Jerry Potts was half Scottish and half Piegan, or half blood, sorry. Just as Joe Kipp, who was the other partner with Charlie Thomas in Fort Kipp, was part white and part Mandan Indian. So they were part of the whiskey trade, but I should say I didn't include them because I was trying to keep it between, as much as possible, between Indian and white.
So he was a mixed marriage prior to the
Yeah. Yes, there were some mixed marriages, again, for the same reason, that took place during the period from about the 1840s, when Fort Benton was established, right through until the settlement period. So that there was the same situation down there, that most of these people who came up were young men, and so they would marry local women who were from the Blackfoot tribes. One of the most outstanding of these was Alexander Culbertson, who was the chief factor at Fort Benton, and he married a blood woman by the name of Holy Snake. And she moved with her husband down to Peoria, Illinois, where they had a plantation called Locust Grove. And she used to live in this beautiful, fine house during the winter, and in the summer she'd pitch her teepee out on the front lawn, which caused some consternation. She finally got homesick and left her husband and came back and married this guy. She became one of the 50 wives of Fred Knauss. And she was an aunt of Chief Red Crow, and she died on the Blood Reserve in around 1890-91. A very interesting person.
This Rosie Davis you talked about too, was she just passed away in the last couple of years?
Yeah, it was about 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah, she was well up into, I think she was over 100 years old when she died. She was a very outstanding person in her own right. She had acted as official interpreter on a number of occasions. She worked with anthropologists coming on the reserve. Very, very strong-minded and very progressive woman.
Did some of these children take their mother's name?
Yes, that happened on quite a number of occasions. Matter of fact, what happened on quite a number of occasions was that the mothers, of course, very seldom learned to speak English. And sometimes the husband spoke Blackfoot, sometimes not. So there was always a language problem. But invariably, a person living or working among Indians was given an Indian name. So if you take a hypothetical situation, a woman marries a white man and she knows his name is Many Horses in Blackfoot. So that's what she calls him, Akautas. And so she is with him. She has a couple of children. They split up. She goes back to her own people. Later on, she's being registered on the rolls, and they say, well, who's the father of these children? Oh, he's a white man. Well, what's his name? Well, his name is Many Horses. Because she doesn't know what his real name was. So you find on a number of the early registers and in baptismal records, father, a white man, and then give his Blackfoot name. This is how, for example, I was able to trace down some of A.B. Hamilton's children, because he was known as Spita, tall man. And so they have it listed in, here's the name of the mother, double gun woman, Natsukapoy Namiaki, and Spitena, or Spita. And so I know right away, well, that's A.B. Hamilton. But at the time this was being entered into the register, all they knew that the name was Tall Man. So yes, a lot of the names did disappear because of that.
Gentleman in the back.
Not so long ago, the Historical Society had a nice article in the book, History of Children Can you tell me why the race worker is left for years was not even mentioned?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear at the end of that.
Why the rent worker, Peter Davis's wife, for many years was not mentioned in the book?
All right, I didn't see the article. I do know that members of the, if you want to call it, white Davis family, have taken quite an interest in the native side of the family. One woman in particular there had extensive interviews with Rosie Davis and gathered information from her. And I had thought by this time that any feeling of prejudice or embarrassment would have disappeared. But if she's not mentioned, that's the only explanation I could give, is that as with the Conrad family, they preferred to create their own kind of legend or fiction. For example, I mentioned that Conrad stated in his will, or left in his will, an equal share to Edward, but he didn't state in the will that Edward was his son. He said a native boy named Charles Edward Conrad, and would not acknowledge that it was indeed his son. That's the only explanation I could give. Yes?
You mentioned this is not the historical mention all the various tribes in the area. Did they speak one language, or could they understand each other? And also, what languages and sound being preserved?
Well, the Blackfoot, Blood, and Piegan were the three tribes in this area, and they all speak a common language. Just recently, there has been a dictionary published. Over the years, there's been a number of dictionaries and grammars published, and there's been some efforts made also to record the language. There's no question that it's dying out rapidly in the face of television. I can remember back in the 50s when I would go to a home on the Blood Reserve that invariably any children of preschool age would be speaking Blackfoot. Very often my welcome at the door when they opened it would be Mista Pudnapiakwa, which is get out of here, white man. Now, almost invariably, if you go to an Indian home and you find any preschool age children, they invariably speak English. So the language is disappearing very rapidly. Now, the only other language groups in this area, the Stonies up near between Calgary and Banff, they speak a dialect of Sioux. And the Sarcees on the outskirts of Calgary, who were allies of the Blackfoot, were usually bilingual. They usually spoke Blackfoot and their own language, Sarcee, which was more related to the tribes farther north. The Sarcee language was so difficult that traders could never understand it. Someone said, not too nicely, I think at one time, that speaking Sarcee, or hearing people speaking Sarcee, was like listening to a room full of Chinese trying to imitate a room full of chickens. So it was a very difficult language, a lot of little glottal stops and so on in it. But generally, Blackfoot language was a language spoken in this part of the country.
Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen?
What about the Hodina? Are they Blackfoot?
No, they're Cree. That's the most southerly penetration of the Cree. There's the 4 bands there, and there's some other Cree bands over at Rocky Mountain House. And that was just the southern edge of their original hunting grounds. So you can pretty well say that the line between Blackfoot and Cree was just a few miles north of the Bow River. And from then on, it was either disputed territory or Cree territory.
Well, if there are no further questions, on behalf of the university, the Lethbridge Historical Society, and the community, thank you very much for having come to inaugurate this series. We're very pleased to have you. You've given us a very interesting insight into the origins of some of the southern Alberta elite. I think there's something in here that maybe we could have a mini-series quite easily, and I hope that we'll hear more from you on this subject later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.